reception afterwards.
Is it still going? Yes.
And our final speaker of the afternoon will be Professor Sean Kelly from Harvard University. His paper is entitled The Teacher.
Okay.
What's the subtitle?
I will tell you the subtitle in just a second. Does everyone have a handout?
No.
Okay, there's, let's see. There are 2 pages to the handout. Some of these have them front and back, and others of them have them. Yeah.
Who needs a handout?
Sean's talk.
Okay, so, you know, like so many people in the room, I owe my interest in philosophy and my orientation in philosophy to Bert. When I came to Berkeley many years ago, I wasn't in philosophy. I was in math, and I did a lot of artificial intelligence, and I found it unsatisfying. And I sort of came to the philosophy department looking for criticisms, and so I naturally gravitated to John Searle, whose criticisms I thought I understood, and to Bert, whose criticisms I didn't understand at all, and that made me more interested. And I decided I had to read Heidegger because Bert's intuition seemed to come from his reading of Heidegger, and so I carried my copy of Being and Time around with me everywhere I went for about 4 or 5 years, trying to decide if it was worth spending any time with it. and you know, finally, with Bert's help, I decided it was. So I want to talk today about what it is to be a teacher. The title of the talk is The Teacher, and it's inspired by my interactions with and experiences with Bert. The talk has a secret subtitle that doesn't appear on the program. The subtitle of the talk is Socrates, Jesus, Heidegger, and Bert. So there are 4 sections. I'm going to read it. Section 1. In a reflection upon his life at 80 years old, written in 1971, Hannah Arendt comments upon the importance of Martin Heidegger's work as a teacher. Heidegger's fame, Arendt writes, this is number 1 on your handout, predates by about 8 years the publication of Being and Time in 1927. Indeed, it's open to question whether the unusual success of this book would have been possible if it had not been preceded by the teacher's reputation among his students. There was something strange about this early fame, Arendt continues. Stranger, perhaps, than the fame of Kafka in the early 20s, or of Braque and Picasso in the preceding decade. For in Heidegger's case, there was nothing tangible on which his fame could have been based, nothing written, save for notes taken at his lectures, which circulated among students everywhere. These lectures dealt with texts that were generally familiar. They contained no doctrine that could have been learned, reproduced, and handed on. There was hardly more than a name, but the name traveled all over Germany like the rumor of a hidden king. When I arrived at Berkeley in the fall of 1989, something similar could have been said about Hubert Dreyfus. Although I was in the logic group at the time, my home was in mathematics, it was not long before student scuttlebutt drew me to Dreyfus courses. These were extraordinary affairs, filled to overflowing with students sitting on the stairs and in the aisles and out the door of several 100-person lecture halls. The excitement of these events was palpable. This was all the more notable because Bert's own presence in the classroom was at once the focus of all attention and at the same time a kind of absence or vacuum. Much of what we saw was him standing before the assembled group, being puzzled, asking for help, maintaining his confusion, and then every once in a while, if we were lucky, experiencing a breakthrough in which we all felt we shared an ineliminable part. It was electrifying. Bootleg copies of the taped recordings of his lectures circulated like copies of the Grateful Dead. We were talking at lunch. We really have to collect them. I have a whole bunch. Dreyfus' success, like the success of any genuine teacher, is mysterious. To be sure, those who benefited from it felt their lives changed irrevocably. But the more one felt the importance of Dreyfus' teaching, the less one felt able to say in what its power consisted. Not only was it irreducible to a doctrine, it seemed inextricable from him as a person. Younger teachers who tried to imitate his style were reduced to caricature and parody. Moreover, beyond its mystery, the power of Dreyfus' teaching seemed paradoxical. Like Socrates himself, Bert's almost perpetual confusion seemed rather to establish his authority as a teacher than to eliminate it. And yet, despite its mystery and paradox, Dreyfus' identity as a teacher is at the core of everything he does. Beyond his myriad books and articles, his academic titles and honors, and his intellectual imprint on the profession of philosophy, Bert's influence as a teacher is what will always be remembered first. In this way, to be a teacher is both the key to who Bert Dreyfus is, and at the same time, because of the deep and abiding mystery of the phenomenon of teaching, hardly more than a name. It's for this reason, both in honor of Bert and keeping constantly in mind his own example, that I would like to explore today the question, what is it to be a teacher? Section 2 is called, Can One Human Being Teach Another? Teaching is a peculiar art. Indeed, one prominent thread in the history of philosophy, owing its primary development to Plato, Augustine, and Kierkegaard, suggests that one human being can never teach another. As Kierkegaard says in the Philosophical Fragments, this is passage 2 on your handout, between one human being and another, the teacher leaves no claim upon the pupil's soul. Human beings can, of course, on this account, interact with one another. They can talk, discuss, examine, and question together, for example. But in doing so, one human being never brings it about, on this view, that another human being comes to know something that he or she didn't already know. In this way, the interaction between and among human beings is essentially inconsequential or accidental. Although it may turn out that in the context of discussion or questioning between human beings, one of them comes to know something, however we understand the term know. Nevertheless, this result cannot have been due in any relevant way to the other person. This is the basic sense in which it's held that no human being can ever teach another. So much is agreed upon by all the advocates of this position, but there are two distinct explanations for the human incapacity to teach. They belong to the Greek and the Christian traditions, respectively. Roughly speaking, the Greek tradition, with its locus in certain of Plato's texts, is held to say that no person can teach another because no student can learn something she didn't already know. This is related, so it's said, in the interpretation of Plato, to the so-called doctrine of recollection in the Meno, which holds that what seems like learning is really a matter of remembering knowledge one already had. We shall look at this doctrine a little more closely in a moment. But the Greek tradition differs dramatically from the Christian. Where the Greek tradition holds that no human being can ever transition from not knowing to knowing, or in a related terminology, from being outside the truth to being within it, the Christian sees this transition as the most basic possibility of human existence. Indeed, the entire vocabulary of Christian salvation is oriented around the idea of being transformed, literally of being reborn from the untruth into the truth. So although the Christian agrees with the Greek that no human being can ever teach another, he disagrees that this is because no learning or change can ever be brought about in a human being. The problem is not that no human being can ever learn, but, on the Christian view, that this learning can only be brought about by God. In short, the Greek and Christian traditions agree that no human being can ever teach another, but the Greek thinks this is because no human student can learn, the Christian because no human teacher can teach. Kierkegaard spells out the distinction between this interpretation of the Greek and Christian accounts in his fascinating and wide-ranging discussion of Socrates. Kierkegaard's view is that Socrates got as far in his understanding of what human beings are as one reasonably could have been expected to get, given that he was merely human and that he lived without the benefit of Jesus. I will try to suggest, by contrast, that Socrates got further than Kierkegaard thought, and indeed that he got exactly as far as one could hope. In fact, I will claim we understand Socrates best by thinking about the kind of teacher Bert has been. This suggestion will involve a somewhat non-traditional reading of Socrates, in effect, reading him as Bert. It will therefore amount to what Heidegger might have called a strong interpretation, but I hope it will not, for that reason, be unrevealing. So, in the last two sections, which are a bit longer each than the first two sections, I'm going to set up Kierkegaard's view about why Socrates wasn't a teacher and Jesus was, and what account of human beings is held in the respective views of this non-teacher and this teacher that Kierkegaard gives. And then in the last section, I'm going to develop an alternative interpretation of Socrates that shows us why, even though he was human, he was a teacher and the best kind, the Bert kind. So Socrates and Jesus as Kierkegaard saw them. Kierkegaard has enormous praise for Socrates. He talks about the, these are quotes, profundity of Socratic thinking. He applauds what he calls Socrates' noble, thoroughgoing humanity. He loves in particular a trait of Socrates that makes him, in Kierkegaard's mind, almost a Christian, namely that he, quote, does not exclusively and conceitedly cultivate the company of brilliant minds, but feels just as kin to a tanner, unquote. Moreover, Kierkegaard thinks in what I think for him is a characteristic move, that in an age like ours, like his, in which we all so easily imagine we've gone beyond Socrates, in fact, we've failed to recognize how rare his kind of integrity is. Nevertheless, on Kierkegaard's view, Socrates' negative account of human beings, focused rightly as it is on the claim that no human being can teach any other, ultimately falters because it fails to recognize the fundamental way in which human beings are nevertheless capable of being taught. It fails to recognize in particular that the teacher, full stop, is Jesus. The difference between Socrates and Jesus is crucial to Kierkegaard's account of each. In this way, it's also crucial to his account of what human beings are, insofar as we are teachable. Now, there's a whole cluster of observations that Kierkegaard makes about Socrates and Jesus, and about the respective understanding of human beings that's revealed in the way each of them teaches, or fails to do so. These observations range, in my view, from the insightful to the misleading. Some I think are true, but not for the reasons Kierkegaard gives. So I can't talk about all of these, but let me mention briefly 4 of these observations so that we can get a grip on the Kierkegaardian understanding of teaching that I would like eventually to resist. We begin with an apparent similarity between Socrates and Jesus that, according to Kierkegaard, actually hides a radical difference. That is, their respective kinds of humility. Socrates' humility is indeed one of his paradigmatic traits, and Kierkegaard is certainly right to emphasize it. To mention just the obvious facts, Socrates refuses to accept the Delphic oracle's claim, for instance, that he's the wisest man. And throughout at least the early dialogues, the Socratic dialogues, which are the ones that Kierkegaard's primarily focused on, Socrates tends to end his discussions famously in an aporia. That's to say, the dialogues end literally in the recognition that there is no passageway or route, aporos, to an understanding of the issue at hand. Finally, what Kierkegaard calls his negative orientation, that we can neither know anything nor teach any other, on Kierkegaard's interpretation of Socrates, seems to Kierkegaard a humble and honest recognition of the situation Socrates is actually in. Although Kierkegaard's right to emphasize Socrates' humility, however, the reading he gives of it seems to me a distortion. Instead of interpreting Socrates on his own terms, Kierkegaard reads him as a bad approximation of a Christian ideal. In particular, Kierkegaard is keen to show the way in which Socrates both falls short of the full Christian virtue of humility at which human beings should aim, and also that he's no good guide to the godlike humility of Jesus. As to the first, the Christian is properly humbled before God, recognizing his complete and utter dependence upon him, while Socrates, Kierkegaard emphasizes, recognizes no such thing. Indeed, on Kierkegaard's reading, the doctrine of recollection, developed in the Meno among other places, ultimately recognizes no human dependence upon anything, since what we really are on this view is the being who already knows. That's both the key to Socratic humility. We cannot teach another, cannot be anything more, as Socrates says, than a midwife who stands by while another gives birth to himself by remembering what he already knows. And at the same time that it explains Socratic humility, it's also, according to Kierkegaard, a kind of hubris. In effect, on Kierkegaard's reading, Socratic humility is based on a conception of human beings that puts each of us in the position of God. We are God, on Kierkegaard's reading of Socrates, in precisely the sense that our knowledge of ourselves and our project of coming to know ourselves just is knowledge of what is and the project of coming to understand what is. As Kierkegaard says, this is passage 3 on your handout. In the Socratic view, every human being is himself the midpoint, and the whole world focuses only on him because his self-knowledge is God-knowledge. Although Socrates effectively places us in the position of God on Kierkegaard's view, however, his humility is nothing like the humility of Jesus either. That's because, on Kierkegaard's account, Jesus humbles himself in order to be our teacher, while Socrates' humility consists in the recognition that he can never be a teacher, but only a midwife. Now, Kierkegaard's account of Jesus' humility is complicated and I think fascinating. It's too subtle and complicated to go into here in full detail. But let me just gesture at it. Suffice it to say that Jesus' teaching operates on Kierkegaard's interpretation of it through his love for us, and we learn precisely in the sense that when we love him in the right way, we are transformed, reborn, brought into the truth. The key to Jesus' humility, therefore, has to do with the constraint on our ability to love, on Kierkegaard's interpretation. If God appeared to us in all his glory, then we would love him in the wrong way. Standing in awe before his magnificence, we would glorify him, but forget ourselves. So God has to appear to us as our equal, as lowly and servile, if our love for him is going to bring about a transformation in us. Now, this too would present a problem if it were a deception on God's part to appear to us as lowly and servile, since loving God for what he's not would not be loving God. So paradoxically, God, who is actually all-powerful, on Kierkegaard's view, must really also be lowly and servile. Jesus' humility is not, therefore, a farce, but rather both a truth and a necessity. God's love for us is so great, on Kierkegaard's interpretation, that he brings this paradoxical necessity into being. As Kierkegaard writes, this is number 4 on your handout. God must become as equal of the lowliest of persons in the form of a servant. But this form of a servant is not something put on deceptively. It is his true form, even though his true form is also the highest. For this is the boundlessness of love, that in earnestness and truth, and not in jest, it wills to be the equal of the beloved. Jesus' humility is paradoxical, therefore, according to Kierkegaard, but it's also necessary. It makes possible the extraordinary power he has literally to constitute us or to bring us into being. Indeed, we're so completely dependent upon Jesus in Kierkegaard's view that the true self, the self in whom despair is eradicated, is, and now I'm quoting partly from passage 5 on your handout, a famous sentence that Bert relies on a lot from The Sickness to Death. We depend so completely upon Jesus that the true self, the self in whom despair is eradicated, is grounded transparently in him, in the terminology of sickness unto death, and he is the power that establishes us. In sum, then, Kierkegaard thinks that Socrates' humility stems from his belief, mistaken though it is, that human beings are independent of one another and self-sufficient gods. Because the knowledge that we really have is gained through rational intuition of the forms, we must humbly insist on our incapacity ever to affect another. Jesus' humility, by contrast, on Kierkegaard's account, stems from the fact that he really is a God, on the love of whom our salvation depends completely. He takes on the humble form of a lowly servant so that we can love him in the right way, and in doing so, far from being isolated and self-sufficient, we manifest our complete dependence upon Jesus, a dependence upon the person, the God-man, who literally establishes us. And in what Kierkegaard calls Jesus' procreative act, as opposed to the midwifery act, the maieutic act of Socrates, Jesus brings us into being. Now, I've gone into some detail about these two kinds of humility because they're the lens through which Kierkegaard's account of what a teacher really is comes into view. They also stand, I think, in stark contrast with Bert. I'll discuss the contrast with Bert in greater detail in the next section when I present a more Bert-like Socrates. But for the moment, it's worth highlighting that whatever Bert's humility is, and I do take his humility to be central to his way of teaching, it consists neither in his recognition that he can never reach across to another from his position of godlike authority, nor in his recognition that to do so he has to present himself as not knowing something even when he does. There's something else going on in Bert's version of teaching. These two extreme options, that of the completely isolated godlike human and the fully constituting God-man who brings us into being, fully characterize the options on Kierkegaard's view. Only the latter, the God-man, is a teacher for Kierkegaard, and Socrates is no such thing. This is revealed in three further features of Socrates upon which Kierkegaard insists. First, Socrates is not an authority. In the operatic dialogues especially, Socrates is not an authority in the sense that he doesn't know anything. So, at least for this reason, he cannot teach. But furthermore, even if Socrates did stand in a special relation to the truth, even if he were an authority and knew what his students did not, this would not make it possible for him to teach. Kierkegaard highlights this when he says, this is number 6 on your handout, no human being has ever truly been an authority, or has benefited anyone else by being that, or has ever really managed successfully to carry his dependent along. Now, the reason that someone who knows something cannot teach it to someone who doesn't, on Kierkegaard's view, has to do with what is, to my mind, actually the right intuition. I think Kierkegaard's right about something. That teaching is not a matter of transferring information. Indeed, the attempt to transfer information can leave the student worse off than before. Kierkegaard says this explicitly in passage 7 on your handout. If the teacher gives of himself and his erudition, he does not give, but takes away. Then he's not even the other's friend, much less his teacher. Parenthetically, since I've been emphasizing how extreme Kierkegaard's interpretation is, it's only fair to highlight and point out my agreement with him on this part. Kierkegaard, I think, is right to say that if there is such a thing as one human being's teaching another, then about the most fundamental and important issues, it stands in some kind of very tenuous relation to the phenomenon of clearly and authoritatively knowing the thing to be taught and expressing it in a clear and authoritative way. It doesn't follow, I don't think, from this that no person can teach any other, but if she can, it's not by telling the student clearly all the things she knows. I learned this the hard way myself from Bert. Once, not many years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I visited Berkeley and I gave a few lectures in one of his classes. And I worked really hard on these lectures. And I polished them to a fine shine. And I felt they had a structure and a logical clarity that I could be proud of. And after I gave them, I really felt that I'd managed to take something that's very murky. I was talking about Pascal's pensées, and turn it into something pristine and abundantly clear for the students. So I was very excited to talk with Bert about the lectures afterwards, but I could tell he was a little bit uncomfortable. So I asked him what he thought of the lectures, and we went through what he always called in talking about my lectures the post-mortem analysis. I don't know if he used that phrase when talking about other people's lectures, but he saved it for me. But the suggestion in this case seemed to be that the lecture had died somewhere in the middle of my giving it, and it had died precisely from its abundant clarity. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "You said so many true things that there wasn't any space for the students to learn anything." And I think this is precisely what Kierkegaard means when he says that for the teacher to give of himself and his erudition is not to give to, but to take away from the student. There's some kind of golden nugget of wisdom about teaching in there that Bert and Kierkegaard do agree upon, and I think I'm going to try to return to it later. Nevertheless, despite this insight of Kierkegaard's, his account of Socrates doesn't tell us how we should teach, precisely because he doesn't think Socrates could. So let me quickly highlight two final features of Kierkegaard's Socrates that follow from what Kierkegaard sees to be his peculiar kind of humility and his not being a teacher by virtue of his authority. First, Kierkegaard thinks that for Socrates, no relationship between two human beings can ever have any deep or essential significance to either. As gods, each of us is essentially independent of all the others. And in particular, he thinks that whatever effect Socrates does have on his students, it's therefore purely accidental and irrelevant. As Kierkegaard says, this is number 8 on your handout, the fact that I've learned from Socrates can concern me only historically, and not with regard to my essence, to my eternal happiness. For this is given, on Kierkegaard's interpretation of Socrates' view, in the possession of the truth I had from the beginning without knowing it. Finally, and following from this, Kierkegaard offers an account of how we can or should relate to our teachers. He has to put it in scare quotes if it's another human being. In particular, insofar as any learning does happen in Socrates' presence, the student, according to Kierkegaard, owes him no gratitude at all. Now, it might, of course, be natural to feel a certain kind of gratitude or enthusiasm for Socrates, as indeed Plato himself seems to have done, but this enthusiasm can never be appropriate, according to Kierkegaard. As he says, number 9 on the handout, this enthusiasm is still but an illusion, indeed a muddiness of mind in which earthly distinction ferments almost grossly. In fact, the truth in which I rest was in me and emerged from me. In sum, then, Kierkegaard presents us with two diametrically opposed visions of the human being. On the Socratic account, because learning is recollecting what one already knows, no essential change in a person can ever be brought about. A fortiori, no essential change can be brought about by another human being. Furthermore, human beings stand in merely accidental relations to one another, and to the extent that another human being seems to be implicated in my learning, this is in fact an illusion. The person has no authority, or if he does, he cannot transfer it to me, and I therefore owe him no gratitude or passion for whatever it is he has done. By contrast with this, on Kierkegaard's Christian account, learning is being wholly transformed or reborn through God. This miracle of rebirth is made possible because God, through his love for us, took on a form in which our love for him could lead to our salvation. When Christ the teacher consents to my loving him, I'm not only brought into the truth from the untruth, I owe my entire existence and my eternal, undying gratitude to him. So that's the Kierkegaardian view of the options. Human beings can't teach, only God can teach. I want to try now to give